Hi, and welcome to Ivy English. I'm Angela.
And I'm Wesley.
Today we're on page 35 of the magazine, and it is May the 13th.
今天是5月13号.
Now, I just said May the 13th. You can put the there. You can not put the there. The there. It's okay.
OK. 好，所以这个5月13呢，那个 May 13th 或者 May the 13th 那个的有没有都可以。
So today's article is called Tipping in the U.S. And if you were ever interested in doing a deep dive on Google, this is something that Americans argue about a lot. So you can definitely find a lot of really interesting arguments about whether tipping should happen in the U.S.
Yeah, 好，那我们的中文标题呢是走跳美国，小费要有啊。那这篇文章谈的是小费的问题。那刚刚 Angela 老师有讲到说，在美国呢，给小费这件事情其实是有一点争议的哈。有的人认为应该，有的人认为不应该啊。那对我个人来讲啊， well, that's probably the only thing I don't like about the States tipping because my math is really bad.
I'm going to say there's the thing that's the most the largest impediment to traveling in the U.S. is tipping and sales tax.
Oh, yeah.
Because you don't know when you pick an item up or you order an item, you honestly don't know at the end exactly how much you're going to pay. Because there's a price and then there's the sales tax. And the sales tax is computed at the cash register.
Yeah.
And every state is different.
Yeah, you're right. 好，所以这个Angela 老师说在美国买东西啊，有一个问题就是你到付账的时候，大概你才知道你要付多少钱，因为有的时候除了小费之外，还有 sales tax 啊，就是那个销售税啊。那你看到东西的标价，它那个税有的时候有算在里面，有的时候没有算在里面啊。那到底有没有算在里面？你要到付账的时候，通常你才会知道啊。那当然还有另外一个小费的问题。那我刚刚讲，因为我数学不好啊，所以每次在美国要买东西要付账的时候，我现在算头昏脑胀的。
Do you know what's an easy thing, though, is right now it's 20%. When it was 15%, it killed me. But now that it's 20%, you just take 10% and then double it. So if you're going to pay $3.60, that's 36 times 2. That's 60, 70, no, 60. 32. 36 times 2 is 60, 72. 72, yes?
Okay, yeah.
She sneakily pulls out her cell phone. Now that everyone carries cell phones with little calculators on them, we're all much better off.
Yeah, 不过刚刚
Yes, 72.
Oh, okay, yeah. 好，所以呢，这个I obviously I left it to Angela to decide. 我脑袋已经关掉了，在算数学的时候，我脑袋已经关掉了。那 Angela 老师去算就好了啊。那所以这个不过 Angela 老师刚刚讲到说，美国现在这个税这个小费啊，通常是20%了啊。所以这个
Well, that may have changed. That was a couple years ago. I don't
know
now. Yeah.
Okay.
Honestly, though. There's people that think that, if you do a small tip or a big tip, you're in some way improving or disimproving the service. But honestly, servers in America make so little money, restaurant workers, that you just should give them a bigger tip because those guys are their lives are really hard.
Yeah, 好，所以这个其实我们文章里面有提到，在美国给小费呢，其实你还是应该要给的，因为他们的服务人员常常他们底薪是很低的，他们要靠小费。那这个我们文章等一下都会谈到。
Okay, so let's read our article then. One of the first things travelers to the U.S. note on their return is the odd practice of tipping. It's generally not mandatory, though some places will include a set service charge. It's also generally expected, since restaurants are allowed to pay waitstaff less than the minimum wage, with the assumption that they will be making tips. It also means that a meal ends with a math problem, which is not what most people enjoy when dining out. How did this whole situation begin? Interestingly enough, it started in England. Back in the 16th century, there was a custom of giving a veil to servants. Visitors at wealthy estates would give tips to various members of the household, like footmen and valets, upon their departure for the extra work that they caused them. This eventually moved from the homes of the aristocracy to hotels and restaurants. Americans picked up on this trend in the mid-1800s when more people started traveling abroad. Upon their return, they would tip at restaurants to show they were more cultured than those less well-traveled. Despite some backlash, tipping became the norm in the U.S. Around the same time, however, the practice faded away in the UK. The custom of tipping became even more entrenched in the 1960s when a law was passed making it legal for restaurants to pay tipped employees a lower minimum wage. This essentially made diners responsible for the wages of waiters and made tipping more or less mandatory. The debate over fair wages and tipping remains an issue in the U.S. today. The current federal law in the U.S. is that if a waiter makes $30 in tips a month, then they can be paid as low as $2.13 an hour. However, some states have passed their own laws that guarantee waiters the state's standard minimum wage. Minimum wage in the U.S. right now is actually a hugely contentious issue because minimum wage, the law, has failed to keep up with what is in fact the inflation of the economy.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid, minimum wage was like $3 or almost $4. And now minimum wage is only $7.50. Like,
wow.
I was a kid not a long time ago. The economy has gone past then. People have calculated now that if you want somebody, the point of a minimum wage is this, that somebody should work 40 hours a week and have enough to raise a family with 2 kids. A minimum wage should be able to support a 4-person family. And so in the United States, they calculate that to be $15 an hour. Right now, it's only $7.50 an hour. You can see how desperate the people who only make minimum wages. And then think about it, that you can only make $2 an hour in the United States, and you just depend on people giving you tips? That's laughable.
好，所以这个地方谈到这个最低工资的问题哈，这 minimum wage。那这个 Angela 是讲说，在美国现在是也是一个争议的问题啊，因为他们的最低工资太低了啊。那倒是我第一次听到，原来是这样子算的，就是所谓的最低工资的概念呢啊，至少有一段时间是这样，就是他是说，如果一个人每周工作40个小时的话，他赚的钱应该要能够养活一家4口啊，就他还有他的配偶，还有2个小孩。好，那可是以美国现在最低工资这样算的话呢，这其实是养不活的啊，所以最低工资有过低的问题啊，在美国。
So the article begins by saying, one of the first things travelers to the U.S. note, one of the first things that these people will note or notice or talk about on their return, talk about when they get back to their own country, is the odd practice, the weird practice of tipping. Because I think really only the U.S. does this anymore, right?
I'm not sure.
As far as I know.
好，所以呢 one of the first things 好，就最早最快最先谈到的事情，什么事情呢？这个事情是 travelers to the U.S. 到美国去的这个旅客呢，他们所 note 所注意到的一件事情 notice 啊 note 就是 notice on their return 就是他们回来的时候，他们到美国了啊，回来的时候呢，他们最常注意到或最常谈到的一件事情呢，就是这一个 odd practice odd 就是怪怪的哈，这个odd 就是跟你的预期跟一般的好像都不太一样那种感觉啊，所以这怪怪的一种 practice 就是做法，所以有一种怪怪的做法，什么做法呢？ The odd practice of tipping 就是付小费的这种怪怪的做法。
It's generally not mandatory. If something is mandatory, it means that you're required by law to do it, or you're required by the rules to do it. So it's generally not mandatory. You can get away with not tipping people, and that's like one of the biggest kinds of story complaints that you can read on the internet. Some places will include a set service charge, and this is also common in Taiwan.
好，所以这个句子他说 it's generally 好，就 as a rule usually 通常呢这是 not mandatory 这不是必要的，不是强制要求的，强制性的，叫做 mandatory 就是 compulsory 啊，就 compulsory 啊 compulsory 这不是必要的，不是强迫的。好 though 虽然有些地方 some places 啊会 include 它会包括，就算账的时候它的价钱里面有包括一个 set 就是固定的 service charge 服务费，那台湾就是这样子哈，台湾的这个去餐厅吃饭什么通常都有一个 set service charge。
Okay, it turns out I'm wrong. There's lots of countries that also do tips.
所以其实这个还有很多国家也是会收小费的。
However, it's generally expected, even though it's not mandatory. So this sentence contrasts with the previous sentence. The previous sentence says, it's generally not mandatory. At the same time, it's also generally expected. So both attitudes are true. Like, we're not telling you to do it, but we're kind of telling you to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's generally expected since restaurants are allowed to pay waitstaff less than the minimum wage. So they're really not making that money. So if you don't pay them, no one's paying them. And they're doing that with the assumption that they will be making tips. So you see the circular logic. Of course, you'll be getting tips, so therefore we're not going to pay you. Therefore, people have to give them tips because they don't want their service people to starve.
好，所以这个从这里可以看出来这样的一个循环哈，就是他们付的钱工资不高啊，那就是因为他觉得你会拿到你那个客人的小费，所以到最后变得客人不付小费也不行啊。好，所以我们看到这个地方说 ，it is also generally 一般是 expected 是被期待、被预期的，就是没有说你一定要付小费，但是呢，一般会预期你要付小费。为什么呢 ？Since 是因为 restaurants 餐厅呢 are allowed to 他们被允许可以怎么样 pay 支付给wait staff 就是桌边的服务人员less than the minimum wage 他付给这些桌边的服务人员呢，餐厅他们可以付给他们比最低工资还要少的钱那但是有一个重点是 with the assumption that 就是他们做这件事情的时候呢，有一个假定或者有一个认知assumption 是一个假定或者认知好，所以我可以钱付你少一点，但是我们有一个认知，就是一个假定就是说 they will be making tips 他们可以赚小费，这个 making 跟 make money 那个 make 一样，就是赚取的意思 to gain or earn especially by working.
It also means that a meal ends with a math problem. And who wants that? Nobody wants to do math. It's like sudden death by math. And it's not what most people enjoy when dining out, especially when you have a whole group of people and you have to figure out who has to pay what and then who has to pay what part of the service charge. It's just crazy making.
Yeah, 所以 crazy making 对我第一次听到这种就是会让你疯掉所以尤其有一群人的时候呢，你要算谁要付多少，谁要付多少，小费怎么摊那这个是很大的问题所以这句话就是说，这也表示说A meal 出去吃一餐呢 ends with 会以什么来结束呢？以一个数学问题来结束就大家要算数 which 就是这样的一件事情变成一个数学问题的话呢，就不是 what most people enjoy 就不是大多数的人所享受的东西因为大多数人出去吃饭他们 enjoy 的是那个 meal 而不是说随着 meal 而来的那个 math problem 那是他们所以 when dining out 就他们出去吃饭的时候要享受的是那个美食，而不是享受解那个数学问题。
Crazy making or angry making. There's a dash between them, and this is last 15 years on the internet kind of a word. It's a new kind of saying.
所以这是一种这个刚刚讲的 crazy making 中间有一个那个连字号或者是 angry making 那这都是最近在网络上最近几年在网络上常常看到的用法可能还不是真正正式的英文，但是很多人在用了。
So how did this whole situation begin? This is a good sentence to remember because Americans will say this very commonly. When they're trying to understand what's going on, they'll be like, how did this whole thing start? How did this whole thing begin? How did this whole situation happen anyways?
好，所以这个句子大家记得学起来就是你不知道到底发生什么，怎么会这样子呢类似我们中文讲怎么会这样子呢，这样的状况是怎么开始的呢，你就可以用这句话很常用 How did this whole situation begin the whole situation this whole situation 就这整个状况是怎么开始的。
Interestingly enough, it started in England. So it didn't even start in Britain, it started in England.
好，所以 interestingly enough 就是有趣的是个副词，那 enough 在这里不是足够的意思是这里其实是 quite 的意思或者 rather 或者 very 的意思所以这个像如果各位看到一个句子we were glad enough to leave 那个 enough 不是足够，而是说 we were quite happy to leave 的意思
But glad enough to leave is also a little bit negative.
那有一点点negative 的感觉因为那个就是那种快就是这个我还蛮高兴的，走得更好那种感觉。
Yeah, but interestingly enough is neutral. This is like another way of saying that was really interesting.
OK 好，但是 interestingly enough 其实是 neutral， 它没有这个不好的意思在里面所以总之就是有趣的是什么呢？这东西小费是在英国开始的。
Now, back in the 16th century, 400 years ago or so, there was a custom, a tradition of giving what was called a veil to servants.The way I just said what was called is kind of similar to, in Chinese, you say 所谓的.
所谓的.
I wouldn't say a so-called veil, because when we say so-called, we're kind of being sarcastic about it. Like, oh, this so-called happy circumstance, which obviously is not happy. So what we would call is the equivalent of 所谓的 when you're talking about this is a word, this is a term for something.So there was a custom of giving what we would call a veil to servants.OK,
好，所以这里各位要注意一下，这个 so-called 很多人觉得就是完全等于中文的所谓的哈，但其实中文的所谓的有的时候也有那种感觉，有一点点讽刺的意味，就所谓的什么什么哈，就是我其实有点不以为然那种感觉。好，所以英文的 so-called 也有这种感觉，所以你如果不想有那种感觉，你只是说大家都是这样叫他的话，那英文你可以说 what we would call 就好了哈 ，what we would call.
I think so-called is never neutral. It's always negative and sarcastic.OK,
那英文的 so-called 它从来不会是没有这个其他隐含的意义的，它一定都有点负面的意思。所以 so-called 各位记得在英文里面通常都是有点负面、有点讽刺的意味啊。好，所以这个地方我们看到说在16世纪的时候呢，有一个 custom 有一个习俗啊，就是要给一个 veil， 它这里用 quotation marks 放在把它刮起来，表示这个字呢可能在这个意义是不常见的，或者是这个字现在已经不太常用了。
Yeah, let me just quick mention. In English, if we have quotation marks, it lessens the meaning. It makes it sarcastic or less, or that this is fake, or this needs to be pointed out as something we're not familiar with. It's not for emphasis.
好，所以英文的这个双引号呢，不是用来强调的哈。它放在这里的意思就是，通常英文的双引号意思就是说，这个字在这里有一些特别的意义哈，它不是我们经常使用的那个意义，它可能有一些其他的含义在里面啊。所以在这里这个 veil 就是它不是很常见的一个字。好，那但是在这里它的意思就是小费的意思。
Now, visitors at wealthy estates, so places that had a lot of money, what we would call the 1% these days, they would give tips to various members of the household, like footmen, and they were the people who took care of the horses and the transportation, and valets, and these were the people that took care of people's clothes and their personal belongings inside the house.
好，所以呢，这个到一些有钱的哈 wealthy。很富有的 estates 的庄园，通常是很大的，有大片土地的庄园。好，这些访客呢，他们会付小费给不同的 members of the household 就是这一家的人哈，在这里所有的人啊。那例如什么样的人呢？例如说footman 我们叫男仆哈，他可能是在门口接待或者是安排交通等等的。那 valet 是贴身的仆从啊，他负责你的衣着饮食等等。
So they would give them these things upon their departure when they left for the extra work that they caused them, so that the next time they came back, those people would be happy to take care of them.
Yeah, 那他们什么时候付小费给这些仆人呢？是 upon their departure， 就当他们离开的时候啊。那我们前面已经看到 on their return 啊，在这里 upon their departure， 这个 on 跟 upon 用法都一样，在指当什么什么时候的意思啊。那他们付小费 for 是表示原因是因为有 extra work， 他们有一些additional work 一些额外的工作 that they caused them， 这个第一个 they 是这些客人，第二个 caused them 的 them 是这些仆人，所以这些客人造成了这些仆人一些 extra work， 所以他们就给他们一点小费。
Now, this practice eventually moved from the homes of the aristocracy to hotels and restaurants as people started becoming wealthier and hotels and restaurants became more commonplace.
好，所以最后呢 eventually 最后这样的一个做法呢就 moved 从这个 aristocracy 就是贵族有钱人的家呢就慢慢的这个习俗就移到了旅馆还有这个餐厅里面了。
Now, Americans picked up on this trend. They began to notice and copy this trend in the mid-1800s when more people started traveling abroad. And of course, they're all like, oh, that's how the fancy people do it, so we want to be fancy too.
Yeah, 这个 picked up on 在这里也可以说 caught up on 啊，或者 caught on to 了啊 ，caught on to 也可以用来取代这个 picked up on， 也就是他们注意到了啊。那美国人注意到这样的一个风潮啊 ，trend 在这个19世纪中期啊，那个时候呢 ，more people 更多的人开始去旅行啊，而且到国外旅行，所以他们到国外旅行发现有这个习俗，他们就带回美国。
Upon their return, they would tip at restaurants to show that they were more cultured than those less well-traveled. This is a very human thing.
Yeah, 所以他们回来的时候呢，他们就会 在餐厅就给人家小费，目的是要显示说 they were more cultured。 这 cultured 在这里就是类似我们中文讲他们显示他们比较有文化那种感觉啊。
Oh, this is how we do it in Europe, you know.
Yeah. 比起那些less traveled 你们这些比较少旅行的少出门的土包子呢，我比你们更加的有 culture。
Now, despite some backlash, which that's got to be interesting stories, tipping became the norm, became normal in the U.S.
Backlash 就是一些抵制的声浪，就是一些这个反作用，所以虽然有一些抵制的声浪，但是呢 tipping 变成了 the norm， 变成了常态in the U.S.
Around the same time, however, the practice faded away in the UK, which that's hilarious as well.
Yeah. 结果反而呢在英国这种做法呢 faded away 就是 became weaker 慢慢的就消失了。
Now, the custom of tipping became even more entrenched in the 1960s. If something is entrenched, it means that it becomes more and more like you just have to do it. It's like you can have a bacterial infection get more entrenched in your gut, for instance. It's just digging in and becoming permanent.Yeah. And this happened when a law was passed making it legal for restaurants to pay tipped employees a lower minimum wage. And once you make a law like that, no one is going to stop tipping because obviously it's of the advantage to the restaurant owners.
Yeah, 好，所以呢，这个 tipping 的这种习俗呢，在1960年代在美国变得更加的 entrenched。 好 trench 其实就是壕沟或者战壕，所以 entrenched 就是好像挖战壕下去感觉就是更深更这个坚固了，所以叫根深蒂固叫 entrenched。 好，那为什么会在美国更加的根深蒂固呢？因为有一个法律通过了，这个法律 making it legal 让这件事情成为合理的。什么事情合理呢？ For restaurants 让这个餐厅呢 to 让他们去付的是 tipped employees， 他们支付给那些 tipped 就是收小费的这些员工，餐厅可以让他们给他们比较少的最低工资法律允许。
This essentially made diners responsible for the wages of waiters. It made the diners directly responsible for paying waiters. It made tipping more or less mandatory. So we said it's generally not mandatory, but here we find out that it actually is basically more or less mandatory.Yeah,
essentially 就基本上这本质上这个使得 diners responsible for 就去吃饭的人变得让吃饭的人必须要为什么负责呢？ responsible for 为什么负责？为这个服务人员的 wages 他们的工资负责。然后呢使得 tipping 变得多多少少 more or less 变得他们是必要的，就是一定要付小费。
The debate over fair wages and tipping remains an issue in the U.S. today. If something's an issue, it means it's a point of contention, or it means it's something that people argue about. So if an American says, oh, there's an issue here, this is not a neutral statement. It means there's a large problem.
好，所以 issue 就是有争议的意思所以呢这个 the debate over 表示原因，就是大家在争论 debate 争论这个什么是公平的工资还有小费，这样的一个争论呢在美国 remains 仍然是一个争论的议题。
Now, the current federal law in the U.S., and federal law implies the national government. So we don't ever say national government, we say federal government. So the current federal law in the U.S. is that if a waiter makes $30 in tips a month, they can be paid as low as $2.13 an hour.You can say $2.13, you can say $2.13, you can say $2.13. Americans will say $2.13 an hour.
好，所以呢，这里我们看到他说 the current 目前的联邦法律federal law 美国不会讲 national law， 他们会说 federal law。美国联邦法律是呢，如果一个服务人员他是一个月他可以赚30块的小费makes 这个$30 in tips a month， 那他们就可以他们的工资可以 as low as 可以低到怎么样？低到1个小时只能赚$2.13美元那因为他们可以得到很多小费。
However, some states have passed their own laws that guarantee waiters the state's standard minimum wage, which in some places isn't that great anyways, but it's better than $2.13 an hour.
好，但是呢，这个有一些州他们通过了自己的法律 pass their own laws， 那这个自己的法律是怎么样？他们这个法律就 guarantee 保证这些服务人员呢可以得到这个州的标准的最低工资所以这个不同的州会有不同的法律。
Yeah, and just want to say quickly, that is what people find confusing about the U.S., is that every state is actually supposed to be its own nation, which is why we don't talk about national government. And so a lot of laws are taken care of at the state level, and therefore when you cross state lines, everything is different. It's quite confusing.
所以美国有的时候会让人家觉得有点这个搞糊涂的地方，就是他们每一个州有每一个州的法律，所以很多事情你过了这个州的边界就不一样了。
Okay, well, that's it for today. The article continues on tomorrow, so we'll see you then. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.